warm welcome to everyone who is joining us in Zoom and in Facebook, and welcome to already the 10th in a series event within the World HandCOV'd project, which again is a special one. First of all, because this is the last one before the August break, and we'll resume our work at the end of August. Secondly, more importantly, because this is again organized not just by the Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, but also the Compass project, which is, I think I can say UK based, but is very, very international with a huge network, which also includes Belarus as one of the project hubs. And of course, you all know the project thanks to its great contribution to the Minsk Dialogue Forum and plenty of other great work. And of course, the main driving force behind the project is also with us today, and I'll introduce her in a second. But basically, that's the third reason why this is a very special and nice event, because we have great speakers. And let me not waste our time and introduce those speakers. So first of all, I'm very glad that Professor Elena Korostelova has joined us. She is Professor of International Politics and Director of the Global Europe Center, and also the GCRF Compass Project, also representing the University of Kent. And of course, I could continue the affiliations and all the fantastic academic achievements by Elena, but let's us stop at this point and just thank Elena once again for joining us today. Our second speaker is Mr. Tinka Weibical, who represents the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and who is in charge of the, let's say, northern dimension in the analytical work of the Stiftung, which covers quite a few countries in Northern Europe, but also in North America. And Tinko, it's a great pleasure. And also thank you very much for the fantastic food for thought paper that you prepared for this event. And of course, I encourage everyone to read the paper in detail, which is on our website. And the author of the second paper, Alexander Murphy, who is the visiting fellow with us with the Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations, who is a British expert on many things, including on the UK, who currently resides in Belarus. But as you will see in a second, she not only resides in Belarus, but she's currently in a Belarusian forest, which will, of course, add quite a little bit of special aura, Belarusian aura to this discussion. So Alexander, thank you very, very much for joining us from the forest. And of course, traditional thanks to our partners at the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for all the work on the project, and also for contributing to this particular discussion, which will be moderated mainly by the director of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Belarus office, Jakob Belenstein. So Jakob, over to you.
Thank you, Eugenii. Also from my side, welcome to all of our guests and our experts. And thank you, Eugenii and your team on this last session before the summer break in our series, the World HandCOV'd. I'm looking much forward to this discussion because, as we've already said before launching the live stream, this time the papers are exceptionally good. All of them have been good over the years, over the weeks, but these are brilliant also because the two authors take different angles to talk about the changing role of Great Britain in times of COVID. So I would like to hand it over immediately to the person who was last introduced. Alexandra, the floor is yours for your paper and the takeaways in about 5 minutes to get started. Thank you.
Okay, if I unmute, can you hear me okay? Everything's good? Great, okay. Thank you very much for having me. I'm sorry again for my slightly unorthodox location. I'm camping and this is the most sheltered place outside of the tent I could find. But to get straight to it, my paper had two key takeaways really. And up there, what I would like to kind of talk about in this 5-minute summary. The first one is that I think what we've seen over the past few months is that for the UK and the British government, the priority to get Brexit done, to get Brexit done is really the key priority here, and that COVID-19 and the global pandemic is not going to slow them down. That's their goal. And I think we've seen that even in a time of crisis, you know, that the British government has decided not to lean on the European Union, not to cooperate with the European Union. You know, we opted out of the EU vaccine program. We opted out of the ventilator procurement program, the PPE, the protective wear, and decided to go it alone, even though, you know, we were one of the worst hit countries in Europe. We've also, I think it was last month, we decided not to extend the transition period, demonstrating that we are, yes, not going to be held up by this crisis situation, which will be interesting to see how it's going. I know that the negotiators for the Brexit talks are not particularly optimistic at the moment, that, you know, we're hitting a few key problems that we need to probably compromise on to resolve. So again, it's hard to say exactly how that's going to go at the moment, but that was one of the key takeaways, that for the UK right now, Brexit seems to be still its number one priority to get done. The second key takeaway is that, you know, with Brexit and us stepping back from the European Union, you would think that the British government was going to kind of was going to shrink back from anything particularly controversial regarding foreign policy and any difficult foreign policy decisions. And what I found with this paper is that actually it seems to be the opposite. And if you take China, for example, the recent U-turn on Huawei and the 5G shows that we're not willing to compromise, you know, national security and things over trade. And with Hong Kong and the, you know, two countries, one system, and the British responsibility to citizens of Hong Kong, that we are not willing to kind of compromise on human rights issues and our international responsibility. Again, with the treatment of Muslims in northern China. Just, I think, 2 weeks ago, the Chinese ambassador was called out on British TV over this. So we're not shrinking back. Again, with Russia, another example, with Magnitsky, and with the recent revelation of the Russian hacking, we're not, you know, we're making quite confrontational foreign policy choices, despite the fact that we're going to be stepping back. One final point I wanted to very quickly mention as well was, just in case it's not on everybody's radar at the moment, which I mentioned in the paper, is Scotland. And I know that this might seem a little bit, not irrelevant, but, you know, not a pressing matter right now, but I think it's worth noting that even within the UK, they could be facing a crisis that could very much impact our global standing. A recent poll in Scotland, I think it was in the Scotsman, I can't remember which newspaper, but they found now that there is a majority for Scottish independence, and that could be a potential internal crisis we're going to be facing soon, potentially. So it's worth remembering that. So yes, they were I think some of the key points from my paper. I hope that was around 5 minutes. And I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you, Alexandra. That was, I think, exactly 5 minutes.
Oh, perfect.
The summary of the main points, I think, what you mentioned as like a side note, the Scottish element, I think this might be one of the most interesting things to dive in deeper later, because this is so directly related to the crisis that you mentioned, how people appreciate Madam Sturgeon's handling of the crisis much more positively than the one in England. So there might be a very direct effect that would be directly linked to security. But first of all, let us go to Tinko, who is sitting in front of a map of the Cuban basin. Tinko Weibertsal, whom I've known for very, very long. He was my predecessor when I first started working in Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. And Tinko is a very good storyteller. He will tell you the story, how he's actually the one who I have to thank for my stories to tell, from his affiliations in Congo, in Afghanistan, recently in Western Africa. And as a good storyteller, he uses on the first page of his paper the words significant change, drastic long-term effects. So Tinko, you have our attention. and we're looking forward to your summary and takeaways.
Thank you, Jakob. Well, when I say drastic, what I was talking about is mainly the fact that in times of crisis, international cooperation suffers, and the financing of international cooperation usually suffers, especially in times when a crisis, whatever the reason for the crisis may be, is going along with an economic hit and a strong effect on society and the public debate within different countries. Starting chronologically, I think European defense has had a problem ever since the end of the Cold War. And the reason for that is that with the end of the Cold War, we thought that we were surrounded by friends. It would be the end of history. The Soviet Empire collapsed. And this first got in our way when we were talking about the situation in the Balkans in the mid-90s. And when we remember those times, we see clearly that everyone turned towards the United States as the protective power of the West. And it is not an invention of the Donald Trump administration that America has stepped back from that role. During the Obama administration, it became very clear that America is not willing any longer to be the largest protector of Europe's security. And we have had a discussion within the last 10 years, maybe, questioning the actions of the European Union and all the countries of Europe, where I, of course, count in the United Kingdom, because the British Isles haven't sailed away into the Atlantic. They're still part of Europe, you know, being EU membership states or not. But on the other hand, we have seen that we, sorry, I'm just looking at my son here, who's 5. We've seen that we have a discussion and no solution, because even strong economic powers like Germany, who is by far the largest economic power in Europe, is not willing to spend 2% of their GDP on defense, although they promised in 2014. And nowadays in the public debate, there is a strong opposition towards anyone who is talking about increasing defense spending. And even in the last 10 years, where the German economy and the European economy has come out very well of the financial crisis of 2008, it has been very difficult to talk about increased defense spending. We have in Europe basically a division among the countries that are affected by security threats or feel they are affected more, and others who feel they are affected less. For example, the United Kingdom is not ready to address the security threat that Russia poses to an extent that probably would be justified, taking the action of the Russian government ever since 2014. There are countries like Poland and obviously the Baltic states who take a very different approach towards the security threats, the possible security threats coming from the East. And they are basically begging the United States to remain in their role as protective power of Western societies. But we also see countries like Germany and like the United Kingdom who now seem to have other more pressing issues that the national governments address than developing a real strategy of united defense and deterrence and the future of European security. And usually before the COVID crisis, one would have thought that that security is a less affected area of the whole Brexit discussion, because Britain obviously remains a member of NATO, and the protective organization in Europe is NATO and not the European Union, obviously. But then again, with the massive economic hit that all the countries took, that includes Germany, obviously, and the United Kingdom to a larger extent even, I foresee a very problematic discussion about the future of security, because right now we have a combination of the United States withdrawing or partly withdrawing as a protective power. We have no one who is an obvious candidate to replace the United States in that role when it comes to European security. We can clearly state that no single EU or NATO member state outside the United States has the capacity even to fulfill that role. So we are left with no alternative but to develop a common European strategy for security, and the economic hit and the implications of the COVID crisis have not made this discussion easier. And you can see it in all the maneuvers that were cancelled, like Defender. You can see it in the expected decrease of military spending, and you can see it in an increasing number of refocusing on national debates rather than the debates on European security and cooperation. And I think my 5 minutes are up, Jakob. So I'm giving the floor back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tinko. Again, I recommend to all of those who have not read the papers yet to take the time, even after today's discussion, to further read about those arguments. But now we want to take the time of 45 minutes to further develop and discuss what has been said. And first of all, I would like to give the floor over to Jelena for your first comments and impressions and further thoughts on what has been said.
Thank you very much, Jakob, and thank you to both speakers, and fantastic papers, excellent papers, really concise and kind of depicting what is going on. But I'm afraid I'm going to add even more gloom, doom and despondency to this discussion, given the situation we find ourselves in. And based, of course, on the papers that were already presented, I just wanted to make three particular comments. In regard to what is going on vis-a-vis the UK and the world. Well, first of all, I think it is important to put it all in context. And the context, meaning the context within the UK, is very depressing, given the fact that various reports, and I would recommend particularly also to read yesterday's LSE report on kind of tackling the implications of both COVID and Brexit in the years to come. Very, very interesting. So the context is that when the furlough scheme is going to end, it will see the rise of unemployment levels at least by 10%. I think this is a very, very benevolent picture. I think the situation is going to be far worse than that. The public sector net debt is going to rise to 105%. And the biggest worry, and in the newspapers today, in the Guardian already there was a discussion, is that there is a massive risk of redistributing sovereignty and pension funds to actually pay the debt that the UK government has already been accruing for so long. So in this particular context, what the report and already the two presentations have highlighted together is that the double effect of both COVID and Brexit is going to have exceptionally serious implications, not just for the UK standing within the UK, but also the UK as a global power, not even mentioning Scotland for the moment. But in particular, just to quote what they said, is that the double impact on economy will be on the UK economy, which of course will be reflected on the UK's international standing, is that sectors that have not yet been affected by COVID are expected to be hit negatively by Brexit. And that's basically is a very sectors, especially those, of course, in-person trade was seized. And of course, manufacturing in some sectors of the economy picked up. But what Brexit is going to do as a result, of course, with all the new trade, migration, and investment barriers with the EU. So it's going to impact on those sectors of the economy that at the moment are experiencing at least some growth and some opening, which means that altogether the picture is very flat, the picture is very doomed and very depressing. And of course, LSE report is not going to take responsibility for predicting what is happening, but there were some other bodies, like for example, manufacturing body called Make UK, actually now warns that over 50% of manufacturing sector, the sector that is currently performing more or less well, is planning redundancies, which means that massive unemployment levels, massive problems in terms of UK economy. And that, the third point that I want to make, that's to be coupled and compounded also by the effect of no strategy government. There is no strategy, either internal or external, absolutely no strategy, which is also exacerbated by the fact that, you know, there are some moves in terms of reforming the government structures. And I've been involved in some of those talks. And it is absolutely astounding that, you know, there's intention for reform coupled with, well, at least from what I can see, no vision how to reform, what to reform, and where to go, is going to make the whole situation of CV19 and Brexit particularly desperate within the UK, but also in terms of UK international standing. So your presentations are spot on, but the gloom, doom, and despondency, I think, is going to be even more alarming in terms of what is there to come next.
Thank you, Elena, for making the picture even darker than it was before. I would like to already encourage the audience to write your questions, since we will have to finish a bit earlier today, since Elena will have to leave sharply at 12:30 Vilnius and Minsk time. But first of all, I would like to get back to our experts with a few questions to get the discussion among ourselves going. And coming back maybe to the Scotland issue, because I think this is particularly interesting, because it stands in line in a way with what we've been discussing over the past weeks, that factors that have been around in situations and moods are now being exacerbated by the handling of COVID, and not immediately the health issues, but the handling. And I think this is also like the baseline of what we've heard today. It's not so much the health issue, but the economic repercussions. But coming back to the Scotland issue, Alexandra, how strong is this factor now in the assessment? You mentioned in your paper this recent poll that there's a majority now in recent polls for Scottish independence that could lead to another referendum after the upcoming elections. How strong do you see this factor at the moment?
Okay, I mean, I wanted to include it as something definitely worth keeping an eye on. Next year, there are elections in the Scottish Parliament, and I think if the Scottish Nationalist Party, if they win a huge majority, it could be quite difficult for the British government not to see that as a mandate for a new referendum. So I do think keeping an eye next year on what happens in these elections in Scotland will be very important. Also, what I think, I mean, I lived in Scotland during the last referendum, and one of the big arguments on the ground there that people were discussing was, well, but if we vote for independence and we leave the United Kingdom, maybe we won't be able to rejoin the European Union as an independent Scotland. This was one of the huge arguments that lots of people were talking about, and it was really one of the pull factors for no. That, you know, remaining in the United Kingdom was a way that Scotland could ensure its position in the European Union. So that's gone, and I do think that combined, you know, so Brexit combined with this perception that Nicola Sturgeon has handled, whether she has or not, the perception is there that she has handled it more competently than Boris Johnson and in Westminster. So I do think that this could grow, and I think that, like as Elena was saying, the economic repercussions that are coming, I think, will only exacerbate tensions within the UK, probably, as life does become more difficult, as we see more and more unemployment, we see more, factors coming from Brexit and coming from COVID-19. I think that when you have countries turning inwards, there's every reason to believe that Scottish people might also do the same. It's hard to predict, but I think it's definitely worth keeping an eye on.
So that means that the handling has been, I would also give it back to Elena, also coupled with the question, how the handling of the crisis has been perceived by the population in England, since there was this very strong victory for Boris Johnson last year, and now he's been making headlines around the world as an exceptional example for not handling the crisis well. Although I remember the last conversation I had with our head of office in London, he said that we need to see that by British standards, the reaction was quite exceptional and fast and strong. Tinko is laughing.
Is this a question for me now, or is it Alexandra?
No, it was to Jelena.
Oh, okay, sorry.
No, I just wanted to add to Alexandra's remarks is that actually, if we were to put it in figures, support for Scottish independence literally 2 years ago was sort of around 40-45%, and it was kind of fluctuating. Now it is very strong, 52%, and that is in the situation obviously being affected by COVID and so on. Some even actually kind of joke that Boris Johnson should visit Scotland more often, because that's precisely when the figures for supporting Scottish referendum, they kind of spiked immediately. So obviously there is some correlation there. Whereas in England, I think it was in The Guardian today, a very interesting article examining precisely public support for the government and for the Prime Minister in particular, which continues to dwindle and hitting perhaps one of the most kind of historical lows than ever before. And one of the propositions is that comes now from the government, that to ensure that connection between the government and the people, the cabinet wants to increase open press conferences, the kind of way they did it during the COVID situation, in order to explain their steps and actions better and further. But I'm not really sure how this would increase the levels of trust. But trust is actually essential, especially in the situation of economic downturn.
But just to quote what you said in your opening statement, if there's no plan at all, what can you communicate to the public? Maybe it's then even better not to tell rather than painting this image openly. But what Alexandra said is that there seems to be some reluctance to cooperate with EU schemes for political reasons. That seems to be the one strong guiding principle: get Brexit done. Alexandra, do you think that this perception is likely to change once Brexit will be done? So do you expect that we will see in the mid and long term more willingness to cooperate with EU initiatives, also in the peacekeeping sector, for example? So yes. Pragmatism going to be back.
Yes, no, I think right now the British government's stance on the European Union is very much wrapped up in Brexit and wanting to appear strong and decisive, and we can do this all by ourselves. We don't have to go to the EU for support, but I do think that the long-term plan is not like this. Well, like it's been said, they're possibly looking for a strategy, looking for a coherent strategy right now is tricky. But I do believe that this is not a long-term strategy. I do think that we will be cooperating with the European Union once the Brexit question has somewhat subsided and it becomes just our future long-term relations, because the government now has been elected on get Brexit done and so I think is trying to appear strong, because that's where the mandate came from. But I don't see this as a long-term position.
Jelena wants to comment.
Sorry, just literally very, very quickly. The situation, for example, what Britain is currently trying to negotiate with Turkey, I think is quite illustrative of what Alexandra has just mentioned. You see, the UK is trying to negotiate a free trade deal with Turkey, obviously post-Brexit. But of course, any trade deal for the countries that are currently in agreement with the EU, they're very conditional. In a sense, you know, there are strict requirements as to, you know, what kind of trade deal is possible. And as far as the Turkey is concerned, is that a lot of local manufacturing has to take place before it goes into external relations. And that makes it very, very difficult for the relations, for example, between the UK and Turkey in terms of furthering their free trade deal agreement. So in the future, invariably, the UK will have to look into the conditions of what existing trade deals are, especially with countries that are currently bounded to with the EU, and it would be impossible just simply to ignore or simply, you know, just push the EU out of the way. So one way or another, the UK will have to cooperate in that regard.
It's a very valid point. I would like to turn back to you, Tinko, because one of the main arguments that you make is that the immediate effect will be that if there's less money to spend and the focus is national and on solving the economic and social issues, there will be less money available for military spending, and more countries are likely to not meet the 2% threshold. First of all, my question would be, do you think there will be a short-term effect of more countries meeting this threshold if the overall GDP shrinks and we have long-term contracts in the military? So could that be a short-term effect? But also give more impetus to the debate that Germany has been trying to push, that we should rather be looking at capabilities, concrete capabilities. And if there is less money to be spent now and more countries meeting this threshold, showing how this is pretty random, depending on economic performances, and a country being strongly performing rather under fulfilling this threshold. So do you think there might be, what we've also discussed on the NATO panel, a German moment with the NATO that we speak about concrete capabilities?
Well, we have seen a German moment inside the European Union just now with the COVID financial help for many countries. But I think within the public debate, generally, there is not a great motivation in times of economic crisis to increase or uphold a high rate of military spending. I think defense spending is one of the first things that will suffer when the situation gets complicated. This is one thing. The other thing is, when we look at it from a United Kingdom point of view, Alexandra has spoken about Scotland. We're facing a similar situation in Ireland as well. I mean, there's growing nationalism. There's talks about the reunification of Ireland and Northern Ireland. So when you are a British government official or a politician, and you are faced with the possible transformation of the United Kingdom to the United Kingdom of England and Wales, I mean, I'm being very extreme here, I realize that. But how motivated are you to develop common European defense strategies? How motivated are you to pay a contribution to solving a humanitarian crisis in Mali? And how motivated are you to continue nation building in Afghanistan? And this, of course, has to do with the fact that this nation building concept from the early 2000s has not been a great success, let's put it that way. And obviously, this discussion continues. And we might see that a few countries might reach the 2% for a short period of time, given the fact that they cannot cut military spendings as fast as the economy collapses. But this will come to an end sooner or later. But what we need to clearly see that without the United Kingdom, European defense is rather toothless, because the United Kingdom is, of course, one of the greatest military powers in Europe. They have a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council. We cannot do it without the UK, and Europe has to deal with the fact that Brexit is done, and we cannot continue to blame the United Kingdom for the divorce from the European Union, but we need to convince everybody that European defense only works as European defense and not as German, French, or British defense. In that sense, I am not overly optimistic that these strategies will be developed within the next few years, and COVID has made that situation much better.
Do you think there could be a debate which more focuses on sharing of defining concrete capabilities that within NATO, which would also be interesting if, for example, Scotland was to leave the UK, whether it would be immediately able to re-enter NATO. But do you see a debate upcoming that will rather be focusing on this sharing of burden, even despite not having a concise strategy of UK and the European Union in terms of foreign policy priorities?
Well, it has to. I mean, given the military power that Europe has combined potentially, there has to be a debate on the question of how we share burdens, how we share capabilities, and how we address security threats together. And I mean, there are obviously positive developments. When you look at the mission in the Baltic states, when you look at the signals that NATO has sent in the last few years towards the Russian government, it's not all bad. I don't want to paint a picture that is too negative. I'm just saying that the COVID crisis is basically bringing on another focus away from the question of European security towards the question of how do we solve the COVID crisis on a national level. I also don't want to exclude the thought that maybe in the long run, the COVID crisis will lead to an improved understanding of European security and a more intense discussion of the question that Europe might be not defenseless, but not able to defend itself as it used to have been with the United States, and of the question of how we replace the military role of the United States within Europe.
Thank you. Back to you, Alexandra. There was one further item from your paper that was sticking to my mind, which was that you pointed out how Britain wants to continue or even put more emphasis on human rights in its foreign policy. On the other hand, and there were some good examples for this, on the other hand, you quoted, I think, even the Prime Minister, that foreign policy has to be more interest-based, and one strong token of this that you pointed out was that the Foreign Office and the Department for International Development are going to be merged. So my question to you is there a contrast between pursuing more interest-based foreign policy and human rights as a prerogative in this? Or how do they come together?
Oh, you can. Gosh, that's a big question.
It was a great point.
I think
in the paper.
Sorry?
It was a great point in the paper.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it would depend. So how they could come together, it would depend on who our future, big partners are going to be. I mean, looking at, for example, with China, the more that we stand up to China, it seems maybe the closer we could be moved towards the US. So, I mean, could there be links? Could there be links where your national interest and security and human rights issues could also combine? But also, I mean, with Russia, for example, so with the Magnitsky Act more broadly, we targeted quite a few different countries there, again, which are also so we've targeted quite a few different countries, which I think a lot of our allies have also targeted. So then there you could also have national interests mixed with human rights issues. But I mean, I'm not so sure, to be honest. It's something to think about. How these two things could combine.
Wonderful. Maybe, so thank you for bringing that up. And just again, before we continue, I saw somebody raising their hand from the audience. Please, if you have questions, we already have the first questions coming in. Please write them down either in the chat function or even better in the Q&A function. So I would like to take the same question to you, Jelena, where you see the foreign policy interests of Britain between interest-based and human rights-based, and also combined with the issue that we've been seeing over the last years, that British embassies in Central and Eastern Europe seem to have been piling up their personnel. And Britain is being valued very much in this region. You know, Estonia, we have 900 servicemen and women as a guarantee for the security. And, you know, security is very much in everybody's mind in Central and Eastern Europe. So do you see a post-EU Britain using the Office for Defense as a diplomatic tool to make new friends or retain old friends and have them maybe support more benign contracts between the EU and Britain?
What I could see is likely to happen is that basically Britain is going to become more pragmatic in its foreign policy approach. Pragmatic in a sense that if before it had to a degree kind of moderate its foreign policies by the kind of collective agreement that it was bounded by with the EU. This time round, I think, is going to be more pragmatic in terms of pursuing its own interests and perhaps less. I'm not really sure at this moment of time how human rights element is going to be embedded in the new foreign policy. But what is interesting is one of the elements for reforming the Whitehall, and especially in terms of the merger between FCO and DFID, is precisely to ensure better connection and connectivity between in-country officials, embassies, and obviously and the centre, London. And that could potentially, if this is where to go ahead, then it could potentially be seen as a progressive move to ensure that British interests not only are better represented on the ground, but also in terms of developing new partnerships, strategic partnerships. However, I think this is a very much long-term perspective because given the situation now, and you know, especially in terms of the merger between DFID and FCO, I think the idea, in the words of the Prime Minister, is actually to decrease the unnecessary spending, which means that possibly the staff, the internal staff, is going to see some considerable cuts even further. And that would really limit their capacity to think not just strategically, but also pragmatically as to how it might go on the ground. So as I say, gloom, doom and despondency, they're very much around everything that is currently happening in the UK.
We have a comment from Jonathan Millens of the University of Antwerp, which pretty much supports, I think, what we've just heard, that if you look at the merging of the Foreign Office and the International Development Department, it provides a strong indication that the current government sees the use of foreign aid as a diplomatic tool to be used in the national interest. Tinko, giving that similar question to you, in terms of national interest and human rights-based approach, how do you see, or do you see overlap, and in which specific fields for foreign policy coordination of the European Union, which wants to be have a stronger geopolitical role, and Britain, which seems to be more assertive now on certain issues like Huawei, like China, that the European Union has been criticizing, but maybe not taking as strong concrete steps?
Well, first of all, to a greater or lesser extent, foreign aid has always been and will always be a diplomatic tool. When we look at foreign aid in Africa, in Asian countries, in Latin America, it has always been the goal of the European countries to develop democracies, to make our liberal political system attractive to the countries where the aid goes to. So this is nothing new. The question is whether you organize the humanitarian aid in an own capacity, like Germany does with the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development. You include it into the Foreign Office. This is more or less a technical question. Any foreign aid serves a diplomatic purpose. This is true for China, and this is true for any actor in the international community. And anyone who explains foreign aid purely with altruistic reasons is not telling the truth. So I think this is nothing new, and this is a normal concept. And whether or not you try to save money by combining one institution with another is probably not a change in foreign policy. It's just a question, a more or less technical question. This is to respond to the question of our participant here. And I think we need to rethink foreign aid in general, because what good has it done in the last 6 decades in Africa, for example, in many African countries? What good can it do? How and to what extent are we fighting a battle with other actors like China on African soil? A battle fought with money and influence and the right to receive natural resources instead of fighting with weapons, because this is what's taking place. We're trying to push back Chinese influence in Africa, for example, by making our model more attractive, and of course by using money, because it is a battle that is about money, and it will continue. And the question is, how do we address it as Europeans, and what will be our strategy? Because nowadays I cannot see a coherent strategy by European countries combined.
But do you think this sphere or this scenario gives more space for concrete overlap of interests and coordination between the post-Brexit UK and the European Union?
Yeah, well, obviously. I mean, Britain has a national interest also in many other regions of the world. And since Britain, I mean, I cannot stress this point often enough, Britain is, when it comes to values, to political systems, one of our closest allies. And I've seen a somewhat dangerous development in insulting Britain more than we insult China. When it comes to politics and internal development. And if we want to succeed in any field of international cooperation as Europe, this thought needs to include Britain. And if the British are not completely out of their minds, they will notice that too. And they will obviously try to keep up a close cooperation in any field, be it foreign aid, be it defense, be it diplomatic policy, because we are a union of values. And this includes the United States, whether you like Donald Trump or not. This includes Great Britain, whether you like Boris Johnson or not. And the only future that we have as Europe, as the Western world, as liberal democracies, you name it, is if we work together, and if the national governments of the United States and the United Kingdom and any European Union member state have understood that, that would be the first step towards a coherent strategy.
I think it's a very valid point, what you say, because I think Brexit itself, to some extent, is a result of politicians and elites not watching their language and blaming everything on the European Union. And now the European Union, the word divorce has been used so much, treating Britain like a spouse which is divorcing, with a lot of anger and a lot of, regret, may exacerbate things even much further. I would like to come to a final round. Oh, no, sorry, we have a question, from one person in the audience, which is more looking at internal developments in Britain. How long do you expect the current government to be stable? think that picks up from what I asked earlier, how has the handling of the crisis been received? And the role of higher education, which is not exactly the topic of today's session. So maybe, but the current government and their stability, this is pretty much in line with what we want to discuss. Who wants to take the question? Yes, Alexander.
I can. I think the government right now is very stable. They may not be popular at the moment in the UK. They kind of burned through a lot of their political capital with the handling of COVID-19, but Boris Johnson still has an 80-seat majority, I think it is, and he's still in his the first year. We still have another 4 years, I think, to go until there needs to be another election. So I don't see many political instability coming in the UK. Maybe the other panelists will disagree with me, but I think despite him not being so popular at the moment, I don't think his government is going anywhere.
If I might
Sure.
add, just very briefly, it is true, obviously, in terms of representation, the government is very strong. But I think what we should take into account, well, of course, the decreasing popularity of government, but also the rapidly dwindling level of trust. And it, of course, all depends how the government is going to handle the situation in the near future. And the near future, as I keep saying, is going to be far more serious in terms of economic repercussions, in terms of actually higher education sector, which actually has been thrown by the government to the dogs, basically, to fend for themselves. And if that sector is going to collapse, there are going to be massive problems for the government as well, because it's actually one of the very few sectors that government decided not to kind of support in terms of the immediate strategy of coming out of COVID. So the situation, depending how government, of course, is going to handle the forthcoming crisis. I'm not even talking about the potential second wave, but the forthcoming crisis and economic problems and challenges. The future might actually be rather uncertain in terms of stability or not. But the higher education sector at the moment is suffering dramatically. Just to answer very briefly the second question. And I think what we are very likely to see in the near future is that quite a great number of universities that do not perhaps belong to this kind of large invested Russell group are very likely to disappear if they don't handle student recruitment well enough. But we all know that at the moment, international student mobility is a massive unknown factor in that regard.
Because you mentioned the possibility of a second wave, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion in all the countries that pretty much handled the first wave well in terms of health and personal security. Right now, for example, in Lithuania, from where I'm joining this morning, the masks will be reintroduced on Saturday. You will be asked to wear them again on public transport and in shops to make sure the second wave doesn't hit as bad, because nobody seems to be wanting to imagine a second lockdown and the economic consequences that would be disastrous. This is also pretty much the debate in Germany, as much as I'm following this through the news. So how is the British government preparing for this? Or is it preparing for this? Because this would be a massive blow and exacerbate everything that we've discussed today even much, much further.
Well, the government advice last Friday actually was that wearing masks in public spaces, especially in closed public spaces, be it either transport or shops and so on, is compulsory. But it hasn't been enforced. And when you go, for example, to supermarkets, the very much security guards in the supermarkets, they say that we don't really have any legal power to basically to enforce it on the shoppers, which means that everyone takes it kind of variably. And given the fact that actually government itself has undermined its own strategy and scientific advice, but the infamous affair, you know, there is whatever instructions are out there, they may not necessarily now be adhered to, and will always be taken with a pinch of salt.
Thank you. I would like to come to the final question, which we always have in this format, which is implications for Central and Eastern European security. So the question being split into two parts. First of all, do you see any immediate consequences of the British changing position due to COVID and on all the effects for the region? And secondly, what would be your piece of advice to countries in Central and Eastern Europe, how to interact with Britain in order to make sure we don't have a massive strain on security? We have 4 more minutes left before Jelena has to leave, so maybe we start with you. One particular aspect that would be interesting for me from your assessment, do you expect a return of migrant workers when the economy goes down in Britain, that Lithuanians and Poles are likely to go home, and thereby strengthening or undoing part of the brain drain that the region has been suffering from?
Ooh, sorry. Mute. Well, given the fact that there is now this new task force to undertake reforms, to ensure reforms within the government sector has now been set up. So there is hope that it might take a more pragmatic shape and will allow the government to kind of to adjust to the challenges of the new environment, be it internal but also external, and to be a bit more pragmatic but also responsive to these, especially global challenges. So the hope is there, but when it comes to reality, there is still a lot to be done, and of course, put in the context of economic implications, I think is going to be very, very difficult for the government to handle it all, including, of course, the question of migrants. Coming from Kent, living in Kent, I can tell you honestly, on the one hand, the harvest is out there and there is no one to pick it up. So I very much doubt that that the future strategy, well, there is any strategy at the moment, but the future strategy, given the current Brexit wrapped up debate, this kind of not so much animosity, but kind of mistrust of each other, I think it's going to cause a lot of problems. And there were talks to introduce migrants from third countries, but I doubt that it will come to that.
But advice to Central and Eastern Europe and effects?
Advice to keep talking to the British government, especially, you know, different sectors of the British government, because you know, there are very intelligent people there, and I'm sure, you know, if this conversation and communication were to continue, hopefully there will be some positive things coming out of the currently reforming government sector, but also other sectors, you know, public-private initiatives and so on. So just I think dialogue is very important, so that Britain will not remain alone in the post-Brexit environment.
Thank you so much to you, Jelena, for your time, for being with us for this hour, for sharing your expertise. It was a pleasure, and well, you were one of the pioneers with whom we had the first webinar on security in Eastern Europe a few months ago. That also was a test balloon for this whole format, and having you back here just proves that it worked out well. So thank you so much. You will have to go, as you said, but we will continue with this final round with our 2 remaining panelists, and then also have the summary by Eugenii. So again, Jelena, thank you. Have a good day and be safe. So we continue, but takeaways and recommendations for Eastern Europe. Tinker, you want to go first?
Yes, thank you. Well, the recommendations for Eastern Europe is to, but this goes as well for any European country and as well for the United Kingdom, is, you know, you said I'm a good storyteller, so I'll give you a story here. Whenever I talk to African politicians in Africa, and they were telling me on how much they like China and the Chinese development aid and everything is so nice. And, you know, the evil Europeans with all their rules and regulations and everything, and Europe is a dying continent and all this stuff. I was usually asking these guys, you know, where do you send your children to study abroad? Do you send them to Beijing University or do you send them to Oxford? So the thing is, you know, Europe remains an attractive partner in international cooperation, member of the EU or not, first. Second, usually there are nice and intelligent people in the administrations, and this continues to be like that, whether Boris Johnson is in power in the UK or Donald Trump in the US or whoever anywhere. So we need to be more open in our conversations with each other and also in the negotiations, given the fact that we share common values that we do not share with China and not with many Latin American states. We are basically in the same boat, you know, whether the UK is a member of the European Union or not. So we should stop all the I am so mad at my former partner after the divorce and maybe develop a friendship after a failed marriage. So therefore we need to strengthen international cooperation and not weaken it. And we need to stop insulting each other. And this goes for the Eastern European countries once they are insulted because they tend to have a more conservative approach on international relations, as maybe Germany has, and it goes for the British and the French and the Germans as well, in order to decrease the blame game and increase cooperation. And that would be the strongest advice I can give. You know, whether if someone asks my advice, which obviously you have done right now, and I in general, this is my last sentence, I tend to be a bit more optimistic in real life than probably my entering statement in this conference, because I haven't lost hope that common sense will be successful in the long run.
Thank you so much, Tinko. And now to you, Alexandra.
Hello. Yeah. And I don't want to repeat anything that's been said, but I was just thinking now a little bit. I mean, taking one country here in Eastern Europe with Belarus, with the current situation, what kind of, you know, if the British government in the future would be looking to do anything here with Belarus. I mean, we had joint military exercises, I think earlier this year or the end of last year, I don't remember. So, you know, we are, the British government is, you know, forging these kind of partnerships with countries in Eastern Europe. So there is space there possibly to build on relations here. I know that the British embassy here in Belarus is incredibly active. And so I think in terms of this, it's kind of keeping these channels open to build upon them in the future. I mean, this was just one example. I was just thinking of one country. I mean, still with NATO in this region, the UK is very active. I mean, further north in Estonia, for example, but we are still kind of players in this region, and looking at competing with China. Chinese investment, from what I've read, hasn't quite been as big as people expected. It hasn't been as impactful as people expected in this region. So maybe there isn't such big room for competition there. In terms of advice, I would probably be the last person to try and give any advice. But I think that, again, to echo what was said earlier about keeping these channels open and keeping dialogue open, because once the UK does formulate a coherent foreign policy strategy, if there is already these channels open and dialogue open, it would be much easier to form these connections in the future, I hope.
Hope is a wonderful word to end this conversation with. Thank you. And that was also the happy note of THINCO. So thank you again to the two of you. It was a big pleasure to moderate this discussion, which was very insightful. Again, big recommendation, read the papers to everyone who has not done this yet. And this was the last session of our series, the World HandCOV'd, before summer break. But now, before we end, let me hand it over to Eugenii, who will present some takeaways and a summary of today's discussion. Again, thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jakob.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jakob, for the great moderation, and thanks to the speakers for a very insightful and interesting discussion. Even though, as we all saw, one of the big headlines of this discussion has been this phrase, which Yelena repeated several times, which is gloom, doom, and despondency. And of course, I think this is exactly the phrase which has accompanied us throughout the series so far. And in every corner of the world and in every corner of Eurasia and the Euro-Atlantic space, which is the focus of this project, we find a lot of worries, a lot of concerns, and of course, everyone is looking into the future with great potential risks and dangers in mind. And the UK is not an exception. As we all see, the COVID-19 challenges have merged together with the Brexit challenges and unanswered questions, and this has produced quite a gloomy picture. But we've heard a lot of interesting points. Let me just emphasize quite a few of them. So I think we begin with Alexandra confirming that she doesn't see any shrinking back from difficult questions in terms of the UK foreign policy. She also spoke about the Scotland problem, and then we talked about it in greater detail, but there is definitely potential for an internal crisis coming out of potential Scottish developments. At the same time, we had a discussion about how stable the UK government is, and on the one hand, it seems to be quite stable in terms of how powerful the representation of the Conservative Party is in the parliament, but at the same time, I think it was Elena who emphasized that the rapidly dwindling level of trust in the UK and in British politics is inevitably going to be a problem. THINCO spoke about this very important development which you always find in times of crises, and that has to do with the shrinking level of international cooperation, because, of course, all governments focus on their own internal agenda, and normally that agenda is not particularly favorable to spending on security and defense issues. Also, THINCO made an important point that since the Cold War, there has been quite a relaxed feeling in Europe as to security and as to various threats that might undermine European way of life. And that, of course, is an important, even though unwanted development. At the same time, security was not expected to be a main victim of Brexit when Brexit was about to happen. But now that the COVID-19 has aggravated all these developments, we see that it has become one potential victim of this process. We also spoke about pragmatism in British foreign policy, and there has been quite some consensus among the speakers that as Britain has left the EU and as it's been hit hard by the crisis, this pragmatism is a natural thing to happen. And we spoke about the lowering of spending, of unnecessary spending, I think, as it was phrased by the British government. And also a few recommendations which our speaker suggested. So they varied from the need to talk to the UK government no matter what, and no matter what kind of internal government merges take place there, as we discussed the Foreign and Commonwealth Office merged with the International Development Department. So we need to talk. We also need to make use of those channels of cooperation and communication specific topics. And Alexandra gave us the example of Belarus UK military drills that took place earlier this year. So that has to be developed. We also have some space within the NATO framework where Britain remains super active and super important. So all those opportunities are there, but at the same time, we of course need to understand that a lot will depend on how available the resources remain. And again, all this sounds quite gloomy, doomy, but that's what we have at the moment, and that's a good reason to take a short break with our series. The very scenery behind Alexander suggests that we really need to step back from these difficult discussions and take a few weeks to relax. So this is exactly what we are going to do. Thank you once again to all the speakers. Thank you for the great papers. And again, we encourage everyone to read them in more detail. We will use all this material when the project will be wrapping up by an important scenario building exercise, and we'll be reaching out to the speakers of today's event as well for some suggestion and some ideas. So we'll stay in touch. But once again, we're taking a short break, and I think we'll resume our work on the 27th of August. Everyone watching us on Facebook and in Zoom, you are very, very welcome to rejoin us at that point. In the meantime, I hope nothing tremendously tragic is going to happen within these 3 weeks, and we'll be all fine and alive and looking forward to the future no matter what. Thank you once again. It's been a tremendous pleasure.
Thank you. And have fun in the forest of Belarus, Alexandra.
It's getting very windy. I think it's about to rain. Perfect timing. Thank you.
Perfect timing.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Thank
Bye.
you very much,
Have a
Team
nice
Alexander.
day.
Great papers
Bye.
and great discussion. Thanks a lot. We
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.
Bye-bye.